It's hard to imagine a bigger story than the Israel and Hamas war, but in an absolute shocking turn of events, US and EU officials are now quietly talking with the Ukrainian government to shift strategies and broker a deal with Russia to officially end the war. According to NBC News, these conversations have included very broad outlines of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal with Russia. Just look at the incredible reversal from Time magazine, who last year named Zelensky the 2022 Person of the Year. But much like public sentiment across Western countries has changed, Time magazine now reports the situation as the lonely fight of Volodymyr Zelensky. Inside the article, it states Zelensky feels betrayed by his Western allies, and goes on to quote one of Zelensky's advisors who has this to say about the Ukrainian president. He deludes himself. "We are out of options. We're not winning. But try telling him that." This is the beginning of the end for Ukraine, and as I'll explain in today's video, we will look back on this failure for the US and NATO as a defining moment when the world moved away from American hegemony and officially shifted to a multipolar world. Let me explain. For the past 2 years, the US government has pledged hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. We've donated so many weapons that we've depleted our own ammunition reserves, and we've convinced every Western ally to join the American-led sanctions against Russia. For the better part of 2 years, we've heard nothing from Western media other than Ukraine is winning, Putin is losing, the Russian economy is on the verge of collapsing, but the reality couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, the vast majority of the world refused to join Russian sanctions. Over 100 countries around the globe, including the world's largest democracy, India, have not sanctioned Russia. Why? Because sanctions never work, and Russia is too important of a supplier for energy resources. Before the war, India imported less than 3% of crude oil from Russia. Fast forward to today, and India buys more than 40% of crude oil from Russia. Even the United States, who ironically led the charge to force sanctions on Russia, is still doing business with Putin's government. According to the New York Times, American companies are paying around $1 billion a year to Russia's state-owned nuclear agency to buy the fuel that generates more than half of the United States' emissions-free energy. The Russian ruble has recovered to its pre-war exchange rate against the dollar, and most significantly, Russia has positioned itself to endure this war for however long it takes. Over the past few months, we've seen a significant shift from US senior officials, who have started to use the word stalemate to describe the word in Ukraine. Just listen to this clip from Senator Josh Hawley after Zelensky traveled to Washington, D.C. and asked the US Congress for additional funding.
That in the words of President Zelensky, the conflict is a total stalemate. That's what he said. Totally frozen, I believe, was what his words were. Which is also what the administration told us yesterday. The administration told us yesterday they want to spend $100 billion more, our money, more, over the next year in the hopes that it will remain a stalemate. Which leads me to ask, what is the goal here for the United States? I mean, what is it this administration wants to do? I have no earthly idea. They used to say victory, victory, victory. Now it's stalemate forever. In fact, yesterday Milley said there will be no military victory.
Essentially, the war in Ukraine has come down to one simple question. Which side can maintain a military force the longest? According to the NBC article, manpower is at the top of the administration's concerns right now. The US and its allies can provide Ukraine with weaponry, but if they don't have competent forces to use them, it doesn't do a lot of good. Ukraine simply doesn't have enough manpower to win this war against Russia. And with a larger and more important war in the Middle East escalating every day, Zelensky is left with the harsh reality of the situation. Israel is a much more important ally for the United States than Ukraine ever was. Sure, the US was happy to support Ukraine when it was the only major conflict happening in the world. According to US officials, supporting Ukraine was a good investment. The US could weaken one of its largest adversaries in Russia and do so without risking any American lives. Of course, everything changed on October 7th when Israel was attacked by Hamas. Almost overnight, Ukraine went from being the biggest geopolitical story for the past 18 months to an afterthought and barely receiving coverage in Western media. To further confirm this shift, a new poll released this week shows decreasing support for sending additional aid to Ukraine. 41% of Americans now say the US is doing too much to help Ukraine, which is a significant change from just 3 months ago when 24% of Americans said they felt that way. With the US and EU now pushing Ukrainian officials to accept a peace deal, this will be a loss of face for NATO and the United States, who started this war with full confidence, stating they would drive Russians back to pre-invasion lines. Now it looks like Ukraine will probably end up losing at least a fifth of its country, a territory half the size of the UK. Now once again, we'll see Western media try to spin this narrative and say it wasn't a defeat in Ukraine, merely a stalemate. They'll tell the world that NATO has emerged from this conflict stronger than before, with the addition of both Sweden and Finland as new members. Ultimately, Western media will probably just blame Zelensky for poor leadership and walk away from yet another failed war. But like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there is a much larger story unfolding here. If the US and our NATO allies can't defeat Russia, despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars to help Ukraine win this war, it sends a message to the world. The US and NATO aren't as powerful as many thought they were. Of course, US neocons will never admit this, and instead are already planning their next war. Despite the US being involved in both Ukraine and Israel, some Republicans think this isn't enough and now want to take on China over Taiwan. But let's stop and ask a simple question. If the US can't stop Russia, which economically is only 10% that of China, how on earth can the US feel confident that it could contain or even compete with China in a new war? If I were Taiwan, I would be thinking very carefully about the future, especially with the upcoming 2024 presidential elections. Joe Biden said the US would militarily protect Taiwan if China invaded. But once again, this failure in Ukraine should make every Taiwanese question just how good is this US security guarantee? It's time for Taiwanese people to elect government officials who know how to manage the relationship with Beijing, and not listen to the far-right Republicans in America who want to push the island towards independence and use Taiwan in a future proxy war against China. But ultimately, this failure in Ukraine has proved costly for the United States. People are starting to wake up from the mainstream media's narrative that they've been preaching every day and ask simple questions. Why did we send billions of dollars to Ukraine with almost nothing to show for it, while our own economies and countries are falling apart? What would Ukraine look like today if we listened to the words of John Mearsheimer, who correctly predicted 6 years ago that if the US pushes Ukraine to NATO, the result would be the destruction of Ukraine? While the US is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on wars around the world, other superpowers like China are also spending hundreds of billions of dollars, but are doing so on investments to help countries around the world develop and find their place and their voice in this new multipolar world. It's why over 130 countries from around the globe sent representatives to Beijing, China last month to attend China's 10-year anniversary Belt and Road Forum. The BRI Forum was a massive success, and it wasn't a coincidence that just last month, at the same time China was hosting this huge world forum, a new report broke that the Chinese yuan has officially surpassed the euro to become the world's second most used currency in SWIFT trade settlements. This is a huge deal and marks a significant milestone in China's efforts to internationalize its currency. 20 years ago, China was the leading trading partner to only a handful of countries. Fast forward to today, and China is the top trading partner to over 120 countries around the globe. China now exports more to the Muslim world, over $42 billion a month, than to the United States, just over $38 billion a month. Meanwhile, China exports as much to the global south as it does to all developed markets. This is the new multipolar world, and with the stalemate in Ukraine and US and NATO failures, it makes me wonder an even bigger question. Does this mean that China is the biggest winner from the US and NATO failure in Ukraine?